All right. All right, looks like we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome Dr. Harris Love this morning, who's here from George Washington University in DC, where he's an associate clinical professor in the Department of Exercise and Nutrition Science in the Public Health School. He has his master's in physical therapy, PhD in health science and neurology, and holds several director positions at the VA in DC, including the Human Performance Unit and Muscle Morphology, Mechanics, and Performance Lab. So
that's so long.
So that's a mouthful. I'll turn it over to you.
All right, great. Yeah, I'm Michael Harris Love, and thank you so much for having me today. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about sarcopenia, a concept that really hasn't changed over the past 40 years until recently. So I want to talk about how it might be evolving based on the way we assess it and the way we conceptualize it. So I was told to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a rehab scientist, of course, and a physical therapist by training. I've been practicing for over 20 years. Trying to summarize 20 to 30 years, and the slide is ill-advised, so I don't recommend it if you're ever called to do this type of thing. But I did want to retain the slide just to give you some idea about my perspective as an investigator, educator, and administrator. One is that the path was not direct. And so as a first generation college graduate, could definitely relate to students who also go through a similar pathway to finding their own education. So certainly that has informed me as an educator in the way I spend my volunteer time and the way I spend my time as an educator. Importantly, I know there's some students who might be viewing this, and so there are some bumps along the way. Perhaps your bumps were different than mine. But while this phase is important, is that I pretty much became an investigator by accident when my car exploded. I'm at Flagstaff, and I had to find work. And then I ended up knocking on doors across campus till I found work at a functional morphology and comparative physiology lab. And that really ended up being a life-changing experience in terms of ways to think about muscle and ways of thinking about how to add to the profession, not only as a clinician, but as an investigator. The last half was a little bit more direct. I guess I can call this pre-CV and post-CV, kind of just to split the halves here. But again, experience in working with government and working with private facilities, and then going on to try to establish programs from postdoctoral fellowships to internships within the VA system. So there is a somewhat direct path. So I did want to spend a little time talking about some of these places, because these places where I've been in terms of studying or working really informs my perspective when thinking about sarcopenia. Like, you wouldn't think that working on rattlesnake muscle or thinking about antelope muscle would inform us as physical therapists, but learning about muscle beyond peak force, thinking about muscle capacity, thinking about lengthening contractions was a very useful way to start the pathway toward being a therapist. And reflecting on my time at NIH, that was the time to work with rare muscle disease and other disorders. And really, I've actually had to read papers by Shankman and others thinking about chronic conditions and how that really fights this whole idea about episodic medical care. Those two values really don't meet. And so that was really my first time of engaging that idea of how to treat chronic conditions and thinking about muscle in a more deep way. Importantly, we ran an international study involving 30 sites for rituximab, and we also established a strength assessment lab at that facility as well. Then finally, the VA, where I am now, again, we started the strength lab there, and really thinking about muscle disease has transferred well into working with older adults and thinking about sarcopenia. And so these disparate parts really do fit together in thinking about muscle disease as a whole. In terms of the current work, I mentioned a fellowship program. So one is the postdoctoral fellowship at the VA. There, we really tried to focus on encouraging DPT graduates to think about clinical research. We established a program where they have some protected time for clinical work and 75% time for the research, plus a research stipend. So that's been a really successful program for us. We also opened up our clinical research program in 2015. And so now we're running the Human Health and Performance Center, which is a lab, the first lab for rehab science at the VA. And then we have our facility where we're training people throughout the Metro DC area in partnership with Howard, Georgetown, and George Mason. And thinking about the lab, we're involved in a few things. One is that we're involved in intervention research in terms of strength training. And when you think about sarcopenia, we go from very basic science in terms of thinking about how to acquire the images to ways we want to think about it from a clinical perspective. How do we adapt these techniques for the clinic? So the lab does have a spectrum of work when we think about the translation of these bioimaging techniques. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why sarcopenia. So this goes back to kind of my younger, lower BMI myself at NIH, and thinking about my first patient with muscle disease. And what's interesting about working at a facility like that, when you're at a research hospital, that's pretty much the destination of last resort. You've really gone through a lot of options to figure out your ailment if you end up at a research hospital. And muscle disease is a diagnosis of exclusion. So you oftentimes think you have other ailments before you find out what the diagnosis is. In this particular case, when the patient went to his physician, the first thing he was told when he explained that he could no longer rise from a chair is that that's part of getting older. And that really struck me. I mean, if that's normal aging where you can't get out of a chair, I don't even know where to begin with that idea. And so I always thought that if we had awareness of sarcopenia, that would be enough. But really, that's a falsehood. We need more than awareness, we need understanding. And so that really set me on the path to understanding the condition a bit better. So our objectives today, as we talk about sarcopenia, are the following. I want to talk a little bit about muscle health and why it's important to address this in the older adult, which I think this will be a friendly audience to discuss that idea. Then I want to talk about muscle quality. So I mentioned that idea that sarcopenia is more than one thing. So I'll explore about how I mean that exactly. And then finally, I want to talk about how to lower the barriers. Clearly, sarcopenia is an underdiagnosed condition, and so there are barriers that make that so. So I wanted to discuss and explore ways that our research is trying to overcome those barriers through technology and also through informing clinicians about how to approach it. So thinking about sarcopenia, the classic definition was of course, a loss of muscle mass associated with either a low strength or a low function. Of course, they changed that definition about a month before I came to talk to you today. So this has evolved, and I'll show you the new algorithm for that. But based on the best epidemiological information that we have now, it's roughly about 15 to 18% of the population over 65. And for those over 80 or those who are institutionalized, it could rise up to 30%. So the international standards were just recently reestablished. And what they've done now is that they switched low strength before low muscle mass. Part of that is that they thought there wasn't very much inducement for people to look at body composition first and not the impairment level measures. So they've switched this with the hope that more people will actually look at this condition and that it will be easier to test on the front end. But the other aspects of the algorithm pretty much remain the same. And so there's still the staging idea that once you identify a problem, low strength, then you confirm if they have sarcopenia through the imaging or body composition testing, and then you stage it for severity. So that's more or less the process now. So thinking about the clinical implications, it's important for us to ask, why is it even important? And so one thing we know that it's associated with increase on fracture rate and disability, although there's some papers that are now contrary to that, but that's where most of the literature lies. And then I think when you look at the modern research in this area, we're really coming to a synergistic view of muscle in terms of thinking not only about the body composition, but also the muscle performance and how they oftentimes work together. And so oftentimes when you have both the weakness and a loss of muscle mass, we see that the odds of having disablement increases. And so I think that we are looking at it in a more integrated way. An important paper just came out by Heinzfield Group, and many of you may know Stephen from his long work and body composition. And when you think about sarcopenia, no one goes to their physician, with that being the primary problem. It can happen, but oftentimes it's not. So usually it's a secondary condition that's overlapped by a primary condition. But even though the treatment and the management of sarcopenia isn't driven by episodic care, it's important to know that sarcopenia makes almost everything worse. So when you think about these secondary conditions and when you add on to that sarcopenia, we do have increased mortality and increased morbidity. And so I think there is a compelling rationale to address this in a very proactive way. One thing that surprised me being in the clinic, you would think that as part of the standard geriatric examination, that this will be something that one would look for. But when you look at the classic geriatric vital signs, you see that they really are centered on cardiovascular maladies, if you will. They're really focused on things that might portend mortality versus morbidity. But as we reflect on geriatric care, we're really talking about adding life to years versus years of life. That's pretty much been the pervading concept over the past decade or so. So many people have asked for a seat at the table of the geriatric vital examination. Some people have mentioned gait speed, since that's something that's been related to morbidity and mortality in large population studies. And then there's also been a big push by ACRM to think about pain in the older adult and ways to better manage that and to look at it in a formalized way. But you have to ask, when you consider the size of the musculoskeletal system and the importance of skeletal muscle, why is that not really integrated in this process? So we've tried as a group, us along with other groups, to push this idea forward. So there are many reasons why we fail to act. You might be surprised that it only became part of the ICD-9 and 10 codes in the fall of 2016. So this is relatively new, thanks to the group Aging in Motion, which is a collaborative group that includes the APTA and American Society of Aging. They pushed that forward and have convinced the CDC to recognize sarcopenia as a primary and a secondary condition. And so at least being able to code, while it's not a panacea, will at least move us forward. When you reflect on large projects like the MVP program, that's the VA program for 1 million veterans, we're looking at epigenetic factors that influence health. We're going to have all that data. We're halfway through that study now, and we won't be able to match it to simple things like grip strength, gait speed, body composition. We'll never be able, for the most part, to pull that picture together because we're not recording the measures. So this code can help us, at least with natural language processing and big data approaches, to really define the scope of this problem within an integrated system like the VA. Upon trying to establish the funding for our current study looking at this in the Metro DC area, did a very non-experimental thing of looking at all the geriatrics books that I could find in our department, and paging through them all. They all mention a sentence or a section, in a rare case, a chapter on sarcopenia. But it's important to make the distinctions between how we think about sarcopenia as rehab professionals and how other medical professionals may conceptualize the problem. And I mentioned to you in the beginning about patient number one and his experience with his physician, and you see those same ideas reflected in the Merck manual in terms of addressing this only when someone has a disability. So that's counterintuitive to the rehab ethos. And so as healthcare professionals and as rehab professionals, we want to take a different approach. So let's talk about how sarcopenia is not one thing. And so we'll dig a little bit into our data to explore this idea how sarcopenia is more than a loss of muscle mass. One thing that's interesting to think about, because sarcopenia is relatively new compared to other syndromes of aging, is that there is a parallel course with osteoporosis. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel when we think about how to screen and assess and how to address the problem. So certainly they're both age-related syndromes, and we do use similar tools to think about composition of the musculoskeletal system. And we also can use reference data both within the age groups and in younger groups to understand how far along the continuum we are of low muscle mass or normal muscle mass. But also when you think about where bone research has gone, we've gone from looking at just bone mineral density to thinking about the architecture of the trabecular bone and more nuanced ways of thinking about muscle strength and how that might portend a fracture. And a similar thing now is happening with muscle, to go beyond how much muscle you have, but what is the composition, the structure, or the architecture of that muscle? So I want to show you one schematic that's from Ferrucci's group. So he's been a longtime member of the National Institutes on Aging and part of the Baltimore Longitudinal Aging Study. And in the schematic, we're looking at, say, a CT scan image of muscle volume along the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at extension torque. And then you see the curve in the beginning. Muscle size and strength are tightly bound in the beginning and in your 20s and a younger age. But as we age, you see that there's a sharp decline in strength, but a less precipitous decline in muscle mass. And so clearly, as we do get weaker with aging, it's not linked simply to muscle mass alone. And so this was one of many views of thinking about this concept of muscle quality, which we'll dig into a little bit in terms of what that means. But there are lots of literature and lots of signs or markers to tell us that this is true. We recently ran an international symposium on muscle quality, myself and a few members at NIA. And part of our symposium report, or at least my job in that report, was trying to think about a foundational concepts of what muscle quality is, to give us a framework to use. And rather than focus on some of the technical problems, and there are many, it was really a problem of lexicon. Like, what do you mean by muscle quality? The term is just a little bit too vague. So we wanted to dig into the principal qualities of what this means. And as I thought about it some, I wanted to think about who claims or has a right to say what is muscle quality. For instance, if you think about Ann Newman's work in Pittsburgh and you think about their investigations in what's called myosteatosis, a 10-cent term to mean like high levels of muscle fat, they're interested in muscle fat and muscle metabolism, glucose and insulin homeostasis based on how much muscle you have or the quality of muscle. So that's one way to think about muscle quality. If you talk to Todd Manini at the University of Florida, who's trained in physiology, he'll tell you about specific force and thinking about a cubic centimeter or some volume of muscle and how strong that volume of muscle is. And that's a valid way to think about muscle quality. So they're all right. So our view was to think about domains so we can define what we're talking about and to not conflate the ways that we measure with what we're trying to measure. And so there are lots of surrogate measures that give us insight into how muscle performs. But even if you throw muscle composition, I'm not interested in muscle composition in and of itself. I'm interested in muscle composition because how it affects muscle force. I'm interested in muscle composition because of how it affects muscle metabolism. So I think the one thing we wanted to try to push was to think about muscle quality in terms of the domains that we're interested in, and then to separate it from the ways in which we measure those domains. So one tool that I've used as a therapist has been ultrasound to look at muscle quality. And you might be surprised to learn that it's really not the medical research that's really informed us so much. It's really been the meat industry that's taught me the most about how to get at muscle quality. So people that are concerned about the quality of your steak and your hamburger have much more in the game, I think, so far than the medical profession. Be that as it may, there's much that we can learn. So why ultrasound? There's lots of advantages I think that it confers. It allows me in a single exam to look at lean body mass and also to look at muscle quality, or at least one version of that. I avoid ionizing radiation, so we have patient safety first and foremost in mind. I have access to it, much better access than, say, the CT scanner or the MRI scanner. And then obviously there's the issue of time and cost. So there are a lot of reasons to think about this as an alternative. So just a quick primer and what we're looking at. So when we're looking at muscle quality via ultrasound, we're looking at something called echogenicity, which is plainly stated as the brightness of the image on the ultrasound. And we're measuring it through something called grayscale panels or pixels. Now, the grayscale concept is important. It's on a scale of 0 to 255. And why that's important is that if I have an image that is 50 megs or an image that's 1 meg, I can measure both those images from the 0 to 255 scale. So it's very versatile in that sense. And what you need to know is that when a muscle has more fat or when it's brighter, that curve shifts to the right. And when there's less fat, then it tends to shift to the left. So low values tend to be better and higher values tend to be worse. And there are some confounding factors that we think about, as we tell our students, you are not your tools. We use our tools. We're still therapists. So the history and examinations are important. Understanding the factors that can confound echogenicity are also important. So we think about those as well. So in terms of the terms that I'll use to discuss the research, we'll talk about where fat lies. So typically we make a region of interest after we capture an image of muscle. And so we try to move beyond the subcutaneous fat. And so you'll notice that we have intramuscular fat that's within the septa of muscle when you look at the cross-section area of a given extremity. And then you have fat, intramuscular fat, that's within the fascicles of muscle. And if you turn to the right, you'll see that we have lipids within the muscle. And so there are limits to our tool. So ultrasound cannot tell me much about the proportion of lipids or intramyocellular fat, but it does tell me a lot about intermuscular fat. So I'll use the IMAT term for intra and intermuscular fat when I discuss what we found with our ultrasound studies, but it does exclude the intramyocellular fat. And hopefully you caught that. I'll say it again if you need me to. So those are kind of the rules of engagement. And so there has been some foundational work done to say, what is echogenicity and does it represent what we think it represents? And so Pillen did foundational work with biopsies, looking at the relationship of intramuscular fat and the echo values. And then there was a great study by Kima not too long ago using spectroscopy, where we also looked at extramyocellular lipids versus intramyocellular lipids. And he more or less confirmed some of the findings from Pillen several years before. So in thinking about why muscle quality is important, a lot of great work has been done by Calton. And again, we found that sometimes in ambulatory populations, one can lose muscle mass and still not have a fall off in function. or even reach the criteria of low strength. But we do find that muscle quality tends to change before loss of muscle mass. And so as we think about these complex things that are all happening at once, the muscle quality question is important because it may change first. So it might be an early indicator which could prod us to action before we get that level of disability or disablement that we spoke of before. So it's a valuable concept in that regard. So one question we wanted to think about, and this will be reflected in the data from our lab, is how does muscle quality aid case finding? So it's easy to think about the cutoffs for grip strength or the cutoffs on DEXA for how much muscle mass you have, but how do we start to dig into what's good muscle quality versus not so good muscle quality? And so that's part of the questions that we started to ask. So in this section, I want to talk to you about our studies and explain how we use ultrasound and validated the process of looking at both lean body mass as well as poor muscle quality. One thing to consider is the cost benefit in terms of why we're taking on this work. And at least by VA numbers, the cost for me to look at a scan is roughly about $25 to $50 versus $300 or more for a CT scan. So I think the financial inducement, at least in our facility, is pretty obvious. So the process we're using in my lab is shown above. I'm showing you the targets that we're using for scanning. And there are other people who are in the space. So there's a group in Mississippi, and there's a lot of activity in Japan looking at ultrasound to try to validate measures of DEXA for body composition. So I've tried to use sites that are superficial because that's scanner friendly in terms of thinking about signal attenuation. I tried to use sites that are anterior because I want to think about people who are also using power mobility. There has been a lot of attention to low muscle mass in people who are already using power mobility or have other limitations in ambulation. So we wanted to find a process in a clinic that we can easily use, both in a wheelchair and also in an ambulatory clinic. And then in terms of the model that we wanted to use to estimate lean body mass, I wanted to build on something we already knew. We already know from the literature from the past 20 years that BMI explains about 60 to 70% of the variance in lean body mass. So we already start with a lot of information. As imperfect as BMI is, it does tell us that on a consistent basis. So while other models have tried to build an ultrasound-only model, we tried to build on things we already had that was easily attained in the clinic. Then we're also looking at muscle thickness and the sites I'm showing there, as well as the echogenicity or the muscle quality. And this is work I've done with a postdoc named Haniel, who's now working in New York. So this is a cross-validation model, and in our first model, we see what the actual appendicular lean body mass is along the y-axis, and then you see the predicted lean body mass going across the x-axis, and you see our R-squared value, which is fairly good using an ultrasound measure. And then we brought in a second group of similar veterans between the age of 60 and 80 with a different ultrasound machine, because that happens in our hospitals. In fact, that did happen to us in our study. And using the same variables, we found comparable results. And digging into those values a bit, as I mentioned to you before, the largest player in the model was on BMI, and you see the beta weights there in orange. And then you see the other two variants, and that's deltoid muscle thickness and then the deltoid muscle echogenicity. So I did put in the 6 muscles in the model, but after going through the model, this muscle, when you consider its thickness and also its quality, kind of asserted itself and gave us a stronger model. So that wasn't something that we expected, but it gave us a more parsimonious model in this population of African-American male veterans within our clinic. So these are promising findings moving forward in a way to estimate lean body mass without needing DEXA, CT, or MRI. When thinking about how does it perform from a clinical standpoint, we asked the question, well, if we think about the cutoff value for sarcopenia, then what's our sensitivity and specificity using an ultrasound method? And again, we had pretty decent values looking at that with the ultrasound measure predicting what the DEXA value tells us about body composition based on the cutoff criterion for low lean body mass. So After validating the method for lean body mass, want to move on to muscle quality. And so in this study, using the same veterans, we're looking at cross-sectional area of the thigh on the dominant side. And you're seeing the CT scans, which I've used tissue segmentation to separate low muscle quality, which appears in the red or purple pixels, versus the lean body mass, which is more gray. And you see the proportion of intramuscular fat, or IMAT, in the red numerals above each CT slice. And then below it, you see a CT scan that's marked in the same location as the CT scanning site. And we're looking at the brightness of the image. And so the picture is really worth 1,000 words. In this case, you see that the leaner the muscle is, the more dark the ultrasound scan happens to be. And you see the echo values below each ultrasound image. And so here we have very promising results of looking at the association between echo values at the mid-thigh and the CT values. And so while I wouldn't call it a proxy measure, the fact that it does have such a strong association allows us to do some interesting things when we ask questions about what are the implications of having low muscle quality. So one way that we try to look at that is looking at just a basic lipid panel and looking at blood work. And when you see the comparison of the IMAT as measured on CT scan with the echogenicity, you see that there are very similar degrees of association when it comes to postprandial glucose based on the OGTT scores and looking at high density lipids. And so again, they're performing in similar ways. So again, this becomes a very valuable tool if this can tell me what the CT scan could also tell me related to the blood work. This is work done with our postdoc, Brian Seaman, who's now in South Carolina, continuing his research career. Then likewise, we want to look at muscle performance. And so here we're looking at, again, different ways to look at the partition of fat within the body from the echo and the IMAT, overall body fat. And we're looking at grip strength, adjusted and unadjusted. And we're looking at isokinetic knee extension at a slower pace and at a faster pace. And again, looking at this, we see that across the board, and this is consistent with the studies from Japan, that the amount of echo, the higher the echo, the lower the muscle force. And those numbers are similar for the IMAT values that we see in a CT scan. So again, in thinking about how the echo relates to the blood panel and thinking about how the echo relates to the muscle force, we now have a very nice biomarker of muscle quality, because it's more than this one thing. It crosses domains, if you will, muscle quality. So I want to think a little bit about our site. I've showed you sites where we looked at the echo of the rectus femoris. And so many people have asked, is that the right site? Many people, like reviewer number 2, for instance, is very curious about, is that the right way to look at muscle performance? And so we wanted to see if the site that we choose to scan, does it really matter? And how does it change from young adults to older adults? And so this is work that was presented in Poland with our resident sonographer, Khadija Ismail, who's at GW. So in looking at the pattern of echo, basically I wanted to know, how does echogenicity relate to grip strength? So we're using grip strength as a global measure of strength, and we're looking at echo at the mid-thigh as a global measure of myosteatosis or higher levels of muscle fat. And the lighter muscles show the higher levels of grayscale, more muscle fat, and the darker muscles show levels of lower muscle fat. And so there's a pattern that emerges. When we look at all those muscles, regardless of how bright or dark, 5 of the muscles tended to relate to grip strength. So they all had a strong relationship with grip strength. When we look at how it varies from our 20-year-olds to our 60-year-olds, we see that the pattern is the same. The light muscles that were light before are still light. The muscles that were darker or had less fat are still darker, but we see that the grayscale level rises over time. And that level of increased myosteatosis was not different for the deltoid versus the brachioradialis versus the rectus femoris. Another way to visualize that is that I tried to make a global scale where you can kind of look at the average level of echogenicity and then look at each muscle relative to the whole body. And if you kind of focus on the rectus femoris, you'll see how, again, we have lower numbers in the younger population and higher numbers in the older population, but the index is pretty much the same from younger to older. So it shows us that pattern still remains the same. So what this suggests is that we might be able to use multiple muscles as a target in longitudinal studies. Now, this is a cross-sectional study, so there's limitations in this, and it still has to be verified, but this is a positive step forward. So thinking about what we've learned in the lab, how to estimate lean body mass using ultrasound, how to think about muscle quality and measure with ultrasound, we want to think about implementation. How would this change our practice at the VA, and how could one use it in the clinic? And so in thinking about that, it's nice to extol the values, if you will, or the virtues of ultrasound, but to really understand the tool, you need to also understand the limitations of it. And so certainly we wanted to think about the technical challenges related to this technique, the fact that unlike CT and MRI, to certain degrees, there's more of a human interaction when you take a scan. And then just, how would you adapt it? How would you convince people to think about this? And so we wanted to wrestle with all these problems. And so part of this has been really a partnership with us and bioengineering groups throughout our region, first starting out as a student project at Catholic University, thinking about how to do quantitative ultrasound and how to have better control of the psychomotor skills needed to get a good image. We later moved on to Children's Hospital, where we had a more refined technique to measure force and measure angle. And then finally, we partnered with MIT with a third generation device, which allows us laptop access to look at angle of scanning and force in scanning. And so some of our early experiments in this, we tried to quantify how much does the echogenicity or image change based on the angle of measurement and the force of measurement. And so going past 10 degrees does make a difference. And so for some research studies, we are starting to record the information and to control for this information. This is a study that we ran out of Children's Hospital. So it's the rare interaction between a VA facility and a children's facility, but it does work with bioengineering. And so we worked with Kevin Cleary, and you're looking at the KUKA lightweight robot, which is used for acetabular surgeries in the ortho clinic at Children's. But it's also a very refined technique to get criterion measures of scanning versus the human error. So our robot in this study served as our criterion-based scanner, and then we had scanners in our clinic of varying degrees of experience to compare ourselves to the robot when using force controls. It's an interesting study. And looking at that, when you're able to tell the scanner how much force he or she's applying and the angle that they're using, our values are very close across a wide range of forces. So quantitative ultrasound is a very light touch, and it's not a lot of force, but clinical scanning, if you go to look at a cyst in a liver or something along those lines, the forces vary a lot, the angle varies a lot. So going from the quantitative ultrasound scan forces to the more clinical sonography scanning forces, we are still able to remain accurate. Some of the work we're engaging in now is looking not only at grayscale values, because there are limits to the grayscale values, such as intermachine validity. So to make a long story short on this slide, we're looking at mathematical modeling to look at the shape of the grayscale curve. And then maybe the shape may tell us interesting things, even when the amplitude of the values change across machine to machine. So we've looked at a few models for this, like negative binomial models, which looks at the dispersion of it. So anything that has a great deal of dispersion, negative binomial equations can help us with that, and a few others. And what we're trying to quantify here is the heterogeneity of what we see in an image versus just the brightness of the image. And so we want to know if by looking at these models or the shape of the grayscale curve, that would tell us something more than simple image brightness. So this is work done with a member of our lab named Tomas Gonzalez. So what you're looking at here is a typical grayscale image. The mu value represents the grayscale levels. The K value represents the dispersion model. Our global measure strength is grip strength in this case. And we're looking at a schematic of the regression using the dispersion model versus grayscale. And in older adults, it seemed to tell us more in terms of the heterogeneity of the muscle than simple image brightness. The model does not hold with younger adults, so we're still trying to explore the use of this in greater detail. But the fact that it tells us a lot about older muscle is something that we want to think about and explore more in terms of intermachine validity and other approaches. So in terms of the future of our work, this kind of gives some indication of that. And this is a paper that was released about a week ago. So I mentioned we wanted to think about how does this work in the clinic. So I was approached by a nephrologist at the San Francisco VA. And so this was a person who was interested in disability and muscle strength in her patient population. And she had heard about our work concerning portable ultrasound. And so we decided to do a patient care improvement project funded by the VA Center of Innovation. And so this is an ongoing project we have now. We're about halfway done in the quality of that study. So our approach here was pretty simple. Much to my surprise, again, sarcopenia keeps surprising me in the clinic over and over again. So my latest surprise in the clinic is that when I went to the renal clinic, they don't really screen for fall risk. They don't screen for low muscle mass. And so for CKD, this is significant. CKD is one of those ailments where you have accelerated sarcopenia. So there is a rapid loss of muscle. They call it muscle wasting within that population, and they have low bone mineral density. So this is a bad combination. Not only will you fall more, but you're more likely to fracture, and you don't have muscle to help you in the process. So we're not going to change the VA system overnight. We're certainly not going to change geriatric practice overnight, but we can change a clinical unit, and we can demonstrate value in a clinical unit. So for us, this is a strategy to move forward within the VA system and perhaps elsewhere. So what we offered in this clinical care improvement project was to lend a PT, that being me, to their clinic to do the fall risk assessment and to also do the muscle quality assessment, and then to agree to have them get reference values via the DEC. So essentially, this is what is a standard of care for CKD, with us looking at fall risk, muscle measures, and a muscle quality measure. This is work done with our postdoc, Jared Ghali, who's still at the clinic. So, and looking at what we found, keep in mind for stage 3-4 CKD, you're going to find everything. So there's a lot wrong with these patients. You see the numbers here. So many of them have poor strength. A lot of them have slow gait. What stands out here is the SPPB here for their diminished function. And you also see the poor muscle quality values are also fairly low. What is striking here is that when you look at low muscle mass, only 15% really met the criterion standard for sarcopenia. In contrast, you see that a high degree had low muscle quality as well as low function. Now, those Venn diagrams are not perfect, but they're pretty close. And so this was striking. To be honest, I wasn't sure how this was going to come out, because this is a group with accelerated muscle loss. I thought that both low muscle mass and poor muscle quality were both certain cells, but that really wasn't the case here. So in thinking about this, certainly both things are at play in terms of how they function. But when we talk about the idea of muscle quality being an early sign or harbinger of age or age-related muscle dysfunction to come, I think this really illustrates the point well. And looking at how it performed from a clinical standpoint, using the SPPB as our clinical markers, the scores of 8 or below, indicating a moderate degree of risk for disablement. We see here that looking at muscle quality as a cutoff measure was a better way of looking at the sensitivity and specificity related to disablement compared to looking at low muscle mass. So this is a study that we'll build on further within the VA system. And I think it's a good illustration of how this might impact clinical practice. I hope that, and looking at the weight of the research, if we go back to Baumgartner's study back in the early 80s, where the term sarcopenia was coined in a New Mexico elder study, and thinking about low muscle mass, I think that has been a great movement forward, obviously, but it's also constrained our thinking to a certain degree. So I think that now we're able to move past the confines of just muscle mass and think about muscle in a more holistic way, and think about muscle health in a broader way as we find ways to effectively treat our patients. In terms of the take-home messages, despite all of the technology that we talked about in terms of biomedical imaging and bringing this from radiology to PT clinics, simple measures still matter. If I reflect back to the MVP study at the VA, I still want grip strength, I still want walking speed, I want more, but I'll take that. So there are some very simple things that we can do to move geriatric practice forward. I think that when we talk about case finding for sarcopenia, we should consider muscle quality. And as we think about the next iteration of the algorithm, the international consortium groups that try to help us diagnose this condition, I'm hoping that we can integrate muscle quality into that algorithm. So we'll still keep making our case to develop that further. Then I hope that you see that it's not only an intellectual curiosity, but that muscle quality matters in terms of overall health. So when we talk about it as a secondary condition, making primary conditions worse, there are reasons to pursue the diagnosis of sarcopenia. And finally, as we discussed the technology, it's not technology for technology's sake, but that by using the technology, we can lower the barrier to sarcopenia. So I think that when we consider the cost factor for ultrasound versus MRI or CT, that we make a compelling case that we can lower the barriers that have stood in the way. Keep in mind that Goodpaster talked about muscle quality issues and CT scans in the Health ABC study 20 years ago. So we've known about this for 20 years and we've not acted on it at all. And so this gives us an opportunity to act on a knowledge we've known for 20 years about poor muscle quality in a way that makes sense from a clinical standpoint. So briefly, I just wanted to think about this journey of sarcopenia, the work that we're doing, and think more broadly about the program that you have here, of course. And one thing that comes to mind is the strengths that you have here in terms of geriatrics, thinking about the VA and the GREC program and the work that's already happening in the muscle labs and human performance labs here. There's certainly opportunities to think about the first concept that exists within the APTA. So while this is a place that already has excellent students and clinicians that emerge from it, and it's a system that isn't broken, doesn't need to be fixed, there is something to say about what can you do to look beyond the curve and think about what's changing in PT, what threads of technology should be considered within the curriculum. And many of these changes identified by the APTA we're seeing happen now. In the VA, telehealth is a big deal that's occurring now. And when we think about the future of PT, think about your own career. The practice world you inhabit now is not the practice world you graduated from. So it's the same would be true of our students as well today. And certainly patient-generated data will be more of an issue that PTs need to be more comfortable with. PT will have the challenge of keeping a human touch as technology continues to advance. I don't think that's going to go away. So there's some things that will stay the same, and obviously there are things that are changing. And I think that the APTA did a good job of identifying things that are on the horizon that will influence PT practice. Another thing that's important to consider is to think about our advanced clinical training and residencies and fellowships that could emerge here. So certainly thinking about some of the orthopedic specialists you have on staff already, thinking about the strengths of the local medical centers, that we can think about geriatric fellowships or orthopedic fellowships, and that will make a lot of sense and leverage strengths that are already existing here on campus. And even though the numbers aren't great in those programs, it demonstrates expertise in terms of our peer organizations. And so it's still an important thing to pursue. And finally, I wanted to talk just a little bit about this new vision statement, just transforming society, which I think in equal measures people love or hate. So I've heard lots of critical comments about it. I'm not exactly sure what it means. I know that what it means for me, when I think about transforming society, I'm thinking about public health issues. I mean, when we talk about addressing disablement, I think that we already affirm and transform life when we address patient care and influence a patient's life. But when you talk about transforming society, I think there is this larger research that's been coming out where when we think about chronic conditions, when we think about threats to health, this emerging feature that comes up is lack of physical activity. And when you think about the roots of physical therapy, from reconstruction aids and episodic injury-driven care, and you think about our roots from physiotherapy in Europe, the gymnasium concept and performing exercise, I think that we have to kind of unify those concepts more strongly and think about the PT role for health. And so certainly this is something that we can talk about via dual degrees with the DPT and the MPH, and thinking about the PT place in public health, given the latest statements from WHO and other health-related organizations talking about this important issue. So there are ways for us to reconceptualize physical therapy and to think about broadening our approach as healthcare dollars shrink and we go through this tumult in terms of how we deal with the third-party payer system. And with that, I just want to acknowledge people who helped contribute to some of the data that I presented today, our lab members, people in our fellowship program, our local collaborators, and the people who funded the work. With that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you for your time.
So I'll start out. I'm Jennifer Stevens-Lapsley. Very interesting research and certainly a wealth of knowledge, and I'm certainly passionate about muscle sarcopenia. But I'm going to ask you a question. I think this group is interested in really understanding your vision for kind of what your leadership model might look, what your leadership model is, or how you would serve as a program director in terms of style of leadership and structure in a PT program. What would that look like in your eyes?
Sure. I'm trying to learn the organization better, obviously. I mean, I think for me, it's more of what some call the servanthood model of leadership, where it's about facilitating the people around you and making the department better. I mean, I've been a federal employee now for 18 years, so I think it's safe to say I'm not a careerist or, a title chaser. So this job search has been an interesting process for me. It's a big transition, and so it's something I've thought a lot about. But I think in terms of the leadership model, I would call it open, collaborative. Hopefully the personal attributes and the research attributes are things that meld well with what you have here. Based on what I know about it, I think that they could, based on the type of research done here, knowing some of the people that work here, the leadership we've had in the past. But I would call it mostly an open, collaborative leadership style.
Thank you very much for your presentation as well. Kind of following up on Jen's question is, so how would you, I think, want to look at our curriculum, maybe from an educational standpoint? And is there anything you see that you think you could really bring to expand within our curriculum?
Well, yeah, I think I did take a look at the curriculum, and so it seems to be a systems-based approach, one that I'm comfortable with. One might think about the hours of the clinical rotations. I noticed some of the top 10 programs, they tend to veer closer to the 44-week model. I know it's always difficult in terms of the length of the program, and that has to be balanced with the cost of DPT education, which has been a big deal, although it's fairly controlled here at the University of Colorado. But I think that clinical time could be something that's looked at. But I think when I mentioned that first concept from APTA in terms of some of the technology that we're talking about, I think that having those threads in the curriculum without upsetting the apple cart in terms of the normative model would make sense. I think based on my personal background, hopefully the use of biomedical imaging and also buttressing what you already have in musculoskeletal content could help the curriculum some. So I previously taught geriatrics, exercise science, clinical research, and a few courses. They have different names at different schools, but for clinical reasoning, those courses as well. So I would have to know more about where the needs are, but we're certainly willing to contribute.
So I know you mentioned kind of balancing the cost and lengths of programs, and wondered if you had any thoughts on the discussions that are happening in terms of the hybrid programs or online education programs for physical therapists today.
Well, it's certainly something I'm open to. I'm more familiar with that from a post-professional standpoint. So I have participated in programs like that in Indianapolis, and started one required class for their Doctor of Science program at the University of Maryland. That was a hybrid program. I think there are opportunities perhaps to expand the students that we actually cater to using hybrid training. I think you're always limited in a clinical program. I don't want to see physical therapy in terms of the DPT become an online program. I don't know how that's possible, but I do think that there's certain classes, be it leadership courses and others, where we could use it better and perhaps find ways to lower costs or lower the burden even on the student and the faculty by integrating it in a useful way. So I would be open to that discussion, but I wouldn't make wholesale changes in that direction for a DPT program. I think it does have possibilities if you end up thinking about a post-professional program. Thoughts on the side, or okay?
Have one? Yes, thank you very much. You've been in the VA system for quite a while.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what you consider maybe the similarities or differences if you were to join a medical school and a campus that has multiple medical programs on the campus.
Well, I've been in a medical school, so as a core faculty member at GW, that was a program within a medical school. During my time at the University of Maryland, that was also a medical school program. So I think that one of the strengths that I bring is being familiar with biomedical institutions. So working on the campus at NIH, or the largest private practice at the Mayo Clinic. Those are all big facilities that have multiple medical centers involved. And I think that by going back and forth between the VA and our academic partners, I bring the skills of having the view of government or federal practice, of university practice, and a private practice. So I think that I'll be able to navigate those worlds fairly well. And all those systems I mentioned, NIH, Mayo, largest integrated healthcare system, and the VA, those are all large systems. So I think they're similar peer organizations to a certain degree compared to what you have here.
Hey, Michael, my name is Corey. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, I appreciate the description of your leadership as a servant leadership role, and advocating for your team, if you will. Can you give us an example of a time that you've advocated for, whether it be a clinical team or a research team, to get information, get resources, get support for a specific problem that you've dealt with, just to give us an idea of how you would approach that?
Hard to know. In the VA, it's hard to know where to start with that question because that happens every week. You stumped me in reverse. I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, in our current clinical research facility, which is beautiful, that was a facility. When I was recruited from GW to work at the VA, it was with the promise of this lab, which is about 3 years late. And so the early research was pretty much done in a closet. I mean, literally a large closet. And this was during a time we started bringing in fellows. And so I've certainly had to build relationships and negotiate with PM&R, with radiology, with geriatrics, with local universities to make that program work, particularly in its formative years. At GW, while it is a research institution, that PT program, it really functioned as a education first program. There really wasn't a research program there. It was a fledgling program during my time there when we were doing a reaccreditation. And so that was also a place where we had to stretch resources to give students those experiences that they needed, be it specialized clinical research or clinical experiences. And so there were several times where we had to use our own personal relationships and call on favors, if you will, to make those things happen, even when resources were low. From a research standpoint, there are lots of things that we do, as many of you know, to keep students funded, to keep staff employed. And so again, that's more of a day-to-day thing that we have to.
So clinical education question. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing entry-level DPT clinical education, and what would be the program director's role in helping mitigate some of those challenges?
That's an interesting one because some of those things are outside the sphere of our influence to a certain degree. The biggest challenge now is some of the things that have come up in CMS in terms of the reimbursement of student care in a clinic without direct line of sight supervision. Those are things we can certainly work program to program with the APTA on in terms of lobbying for changes there. The big challenge for every clinic, or every program rather, has been making sure you have enough adequate sites and the right number of sites. And so I do think it's important for the director to work with the director of clinical education to constantly build those sites and make sure you have the diversity of sites that you. I think it is an integrated process, but part of that I think is dealing with the outside factors that are putting stress on that system. And some of those are beyond just our academic circle.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm curious if there's been someone that you've come across that's a program director that you would like to emulate as far as your own path towards becoming a program director versus it sounds like you've had a lot of success and a lot of great collaborations from a research standpoint. This would be a little bit of a different direction for your career. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, I could. I mean, I'll probably say this goes back a ways, but Beth Domholt. So Beth Domholt was the dean of physical therapy. They had a dean of physical therapy. And she was also on my readers committee for my doctoral work. Beth is ideal in many ways. Despite her role, she was very approachable. She was firm in making sure that program stayed strong on the university when there were threats to space and resources. probably the most important thing for me, having been part of 4 different faculties, either as affiliate faculty or as core faculty, for me, having the equality and the respect for clinical faculty and research faculty is tantamount. I mean, when you're in a medical school and when you think about the pressures of promotion and tenure, and when you think about the standards in a medical school and their opportunities to publish and function versus those in physical therapy, there's a disparity that the department chair or dean has to really address. And in many ways, well, in all ways, the research faculty, the so-called research faculty and clinical faculty support each other. And they're both vital to the success of a program. And so what I've seen in the past and what I would fight against is anything that would cause a tension between the two. I definitely fight them to make sure that clinical faculty have that level of respect and have a way forward to have promotion within their academic program. So Beth was a good model of that and a way to have a balanced faculty. She showed a way forward to make that happen. I'm sure there are other ways, but I like the approach that she took. Personal relationships and her sense of priority and understanding that.
I'm not a fan of 2-part questions, but I find myself asking one. So, your research is outstanding. The presentation was remarkable. I really appreciate that. This is a shift in your professional trajectory. It seems, but or maybe it's not. But if you could explain what is the motivation to look towards leading a DPT program for you, and then secondly, what challenges you think, what you foresee are going to be the biggest challenges in making that transition?
Well, I mean, at the heart of it, I still see myself as an educator. Research is a way to convey that information, but we bring in trainees, and despite being at the VA, I lecture at the GW DP program every year. We just finished a lecture series in biomedical imaging there. So it is something that's near and dear to my heart. And I kind of mentioned in the very beginning my own educational pathway and background and barriers associated with it. And so, when we volunteer, like I just volunteer at a high school science fair. That's not DPT, but I think it illustrates the point that I'm certainly dedicated to the creation of rehab scientists and clinicians. We started the fellowship program at the VA, not out of necessity, but because it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity with our new building. It was an opportunity with the level of funding that we happen to have had in those successful years to bring in education. So I think that in a larger sense, it's always been and moving to this transition, as it were, for me, there are a lot of different pieces that make sense. Remaining an educator, remaining an administrator, which is something that's happening more and more. Remaining in research and being with a collection of people that have strength in geriatric research and muscle research, a strong program. I mean, I've been part of programs that have struggled a lot too. I haven't been really part of a program like this before. And so for me, it's a sense of adventure too. Not only what I bring, but I'll be getting something too. I mean, I'm excited about the prospect of working with the groups of hospitals and the VA and the GREC that you have here. And so hopefully that's mutual. But I think it is an extension of the education mission that we already have at the VA. And I don't see a problem with that type of transition.
So this is a 2-part question too. Okay, you don't have to answer the first part. So I really want to ask a question about the car imploding, but I won't do that.
Are you coming to dinner tonight?
So I think I've heard bits and pieces with regards to kind of the tripartite mission of a PT program of research, education, clinic, and we can even include service, of course, in that as well. I've certainly gotten a good sense, I think, of your research credentials, if you will. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about the education component as well as your clinical component. And I guess the second part of that, if you could weave in there, is leadership and structure and whether it's distributed, direct, or whatever, how you foresee yourself fulfilling the role of pushing forward that tripartite mission.
But to focus on the education part for a minute, well, let's even go to the clinical part. So again, I mentioned I had a kind of unconventional pathway to academia. So I practiced as a physical therapist full time for 7 years before going back to school. So there were several years of practice. I'm not someone who went just from the bachelor's degree to a doctorate degree. I was in the trenches and doing clinical work. That's something I'm very familiar with. And again, I run an applied lab. I don't run a basic science lab. I'm not a basic scientist. I'm an applied scientist. And so those clinical questions, while every research project isn't directly applicable to the clinic, the research and the clinical problems inform all of those projects. That continues to be the case. In terms of education, again, going back to my time as core faculty, so I ran the exercise science labs and ran the exercise science class. I directed a survey course for the geriatrics part of our curriculum. So there was definitely, class management involved in that. I'm trying to think if that answers your question in terms of the education piece. I mean, one thing that was critical for my role at GEW was, it's interesting, NIH really informed a lot of it. So if you think about the threads that you have, you think about the specialties in PT, there really wasn't a natural place for how do you deal with exercise in a patient that has cancer, or how do you deal with autoimmune diseases from arthritis to more rare diseases, or how does the PT approach someone with HIV and exercise? And so part of my role beyond the exercise science course was integrating those threads within different courses. And so I was very happy to be able to take that experience from NIH and then apply it so that the therapy students had a more full education, thinking about these things beyond the well-trod path of the standard specialty. So from an education standpoint, I think that's one thing that I was able to bring to that program. In terms of the leadership model, I'm not sure if it translates well to the DPT program. So in the lab is pretty much me, myself, and I. However, when we look at the human performance unit, I'm the associate director. So I work with a director, Dr. Kokinos, to run that facility, to encourage people to use our facility, to manage use of space. As associate director, I also work with the medical center director and the ACOS of research. And so it's also working, on both sides of that leadership chain, if you will. So I don't know if it has a model that's similar to the DPT model. For me, a DPT model that's worked well has been having associate directors as well as a director of a program, having someone who is director of research, and obviously, so distributing that leadership makes the most sense. I definitely don't approach this position as someone who has all the answers, but someone that's willing to work with people who are smarter than myself to kind of get at a solution that makes sense. And I think part of that role are bringing people together, be it if it's an area of expertise of mine or an area where I lack the expertise. So I think that's how I will move forward in terms of how to approach this particular opportunity.
Is a one-part question.
Okay.
I will say that I'm horribly impressed with your clinical and translational research. Wonder about your exposure to and value of educational research.
Point. I do have an appreciation for it. I have not worked in that area, but in terms of the GW leadership, both the director and the assistant director, they both had their EDDs. And so in terms of my own training as a teacher and instructor, they were a tremendous influence. And so when it comes to pedagogy, that was helpful. In my doctorate, my minor is in education. So I've had courses in terms of the current model of curricular development and other courses surrounding teaching and teaching practicum before returning to the VA. And so there are some things that do help me as an educator. So in terms of our fellowship program, part of starting it was me writing the curriculum of the program, recruiting the faculty amongst our partner institutions. So it was definitely opportunities to use that facet of my training in that regard.
If you were to come here as director of the program, how would you go about learning more about the curriculum, meeting and understanding faculty and students? What would be your approach?
But I think it's a pretty straightforward one. I mean, it pretty much would be a listening tour and meeting tour. I mean, I would definitely want to know, what everyone is doing and to speak with people with institutional knowledge. I mean, I hope that the reason why you asked me to come as an interviewee is that you saw things, within my skill set or my background that would be helpful to the type of environment that you have here. But I think that early time for the new director, whoever it may be, is listening and learning and finding out the needs. That's why even that last part of the talk, where they asked me to talk a little bit about the vision of the program, I could speak broadly about where I think physical therapy is going and what the challenges are that many faculties have to face. But in terms of your specific needs and in terms of where the faculty wants to go, I wouldn't come with the impression that the imprint of my vision should be the vision for the program. That's really a shared vision, and hopefully the strengths that I bring can help direct that. So really a big part of this interview is me interviewing you and me understanding what is it that the faculty wants. What are the challenges that you face? You're a strong institution, but with strength comes more challenges. So what are those challenges?
As an alum of the program, I'd just like to ask some student-based questions.
Oh, sure.
My first question is, I really appreciated your discussion about your curly path to here. And I want to know how we can find those students in the curls before they keep going and finally find physical therapy. How can we get to those students quicker and make their path a little more straightforward and even present it as an option? Because I feel like some students who are on that path don't even know that this is an option, and I'd like to hear your perspective on that. And my second question is, how do we encourage students to become lifelong APTA members after they leave school, as the engagement seems to decrease significantly after graduation?
I want to take that first part of the question first, because I'm not sure about the second part of that question. That's a great point. I mean, I never knew about the physical therapy profession until I was 23. So I think that illustrates the point well. So that's a tough one. The only reason why I ended up at Mayo is that Rich McGee from Rochester somehow found his way up the 7,000 foot mountain at Flagstaff and was part of a career fair at NAU. I kept a very ratty ring binder of all the schools I was going to go to and all the prereqs I needed to take, and I had a very focused plan on how I was going to go to PT school, and Mayo was not part of that plan. And he came and found me and convinced me otherwise to do that. So that type of advocacy is important. I know that in the national database and application process that we have now, there's still the early admissions process that exists in that centralized process. So thoughts of identifying students early on in the program, in their bachelor's program, to find those students, to link into promising students, and to have them commit to being in the program if they maintain a certain academic standard is a way forward. And I think it's also a reason why I mentioned a volunteer service that my wife and I recently did at the local high school. Us reaching out is important. I mean, as a young student who had moved from Detroit to Arizona, I had to acquire 300 volunteer hours of physical therapy at that time before I could even apply. And I didn't know any physical therapists. And so having faculty members serve as mentors, not only to undergraduates, but also the younger students, is a vital part of that pipeline, I think, to make that happen. The APTA membership thing is a tough nut to crack. I think that many of the programs I've been a part of in their professionalism program have tried to extol the virtues of doing that. I think that's a place to start. I think even though that doesn't work to 100% accuracy, I think we still keep doing that. I think it's still important to mention that. I think it's important for us to highlight the legislative challenges that physical therapy has in terms of reimbursement, and perhaps tying that challenge that perhaps students could relate to why we need to continue to support the organization. And so those might be some strategies, modest strategies to. Is there a question here before? Oh, okay.
Question, and this is how have you, if you have an example, or how would you, if you can't think of an example, build up other people's support and build up other people's professional goals?
Well, the VA likes to use this system they call a coaching system, where you're not telling people or overly directing them what they need to do, but working with them to find a path forward. I mean, I guess from a very traditional standpoint, when we talk about making not only what you might consider a traditional researcher, but I want to think about it in terms of clinical scholarship. When you talk about clinical scholars, be it them developing a new course from a curricular standpoint, or applying for a grant, I think that idea of mentorship or sponsorship or advisement, whatever flavor you want to use, those things are important. It's important for us to mentor each other in that process, to work toward those goals. And while that's obvious from a research standpoint, I think that we don't use it enough from a teaching standpoint. So the peer observations we've used at GW to make better instructors has been something that's been informative to me that we should continue. And I think encouraging the clinical faculty to be clinical scholars and what it means to be a clinical scholar is also a way that we can move forward there. But again, in mentoring each other, and it means myself too. I hope I could call Dr. Shinkman on the phone and say, hey, can you talk me through this issue or give me some advice here? So I think that process has to continue. I mean, that's how faculty matures and grows. And so I think it is a back and forth process.
Hi, my name is Amy. Thank you so much for your presentation. My question is, how do you maintain your work-life balance? And do you mind sharing a little bit about what your life is like outside of work?
I'm glad my wife is not here to discuss that. Actually, having a kid helps. So I have an 11-year-old that keeps us busy and keeps me grounded, so I don't work 24/7. So that's a big part of it. Having a dog helps who has her priorities straight by being on my couch or in my face, or on a walk. So those things help. When I have time, at once upon a time I was an accomplished weightlifter, and so that's an important part of my life. My wife's an artist. I've been an artist in the past, and so there's some things I do to kind of flesh out the picture a bit. But it's a constant battle. I wish I could tell you that I knew how to balance work and life. I'm not. But I think it's something that we continually revisit, and that's important, because otherwise I would burn out and wouldn't have made it to this interview today. So it is something that we're mindful of. But I don't know if I have any great solutions.
So thank you for that honesty.
Yes.
And so I think we all battle that too. But could you tell us what you think your maybe 2 greatest strengths are that you would bring to us, and then 2 areas that maybe we as a shared vision could work on and help you work on?
I would say I'm a good listener. I mean, there's lots of ways of leadership. I'm not an extroverted, type of leader. I tend to be introspective, and so that has a strength of listening well. I think that having gone, or been part of the VA system and large organizations, I'm extremely even-keeled and very resilient. Probably my 2 greatest strengths. In terms of the shared vision, I listened to the annual report that they gave for the medical center and some of my research to understand the facility better. And one thing that was mentioned by the chancellor was strengthening bioengineering here. And while I don't think that should be the sole focus of the program, I think that a tighter relationship with bioengineering and some of the goals I mentioned that the APTA laid out, having that be even more represented within the PhD program or threads in the curriculum, given the emerging view of technology and PT would be important. I think it's important to prepare the students as best as one can for the future practice world that they're going to inherit. Probably one part to move forward, because again, it's already a strong program. So the question is, how do we become better and broaden or grow in the right way?
And I'm building on that question. If you were to hire an executive coach, what would that executive coach work with you on? What are some areas of that would be targeted in terms of professional growth and weaknesses, areas that you would want to potentially have someone help you with?
I think the one question came up before. I think the work-life thing is the work-life balance thing is always a powerful one. And again, I mean, I still have personal goals. Like we're talking about these big corporate vision goals and things that we can do collectively, but individually I still have goals and things that I would like to achieve. So I'm always looking for ways to be a better instructor and working with really talented clinical scholars and education scholars that can help me do that. There's certainly things in a lab I wish I could do better, and to expand the capabilities of my laboratory group. So there are a lot of ways I'm looking to personally improve and grow from a focus standpoint of my work and a broader standpoint of again, trying to manage a lot of responsibilities and skills. All that's a piece of it.
You mentioned, by the way, thank you for your presentation. It was fascinating. You mentioned the term resilience, and that's something that we've talked about as a program, the resilience of our students, because the curriculum in a 2.5-year program has been pretty intense in some semesters, and some students are seeing burnout, feeling burnout. And I think the transition to clinic with productivity standards and that sort of thing is a real challenge to them. What do you think we could do as faculty or as a program, or what have you seen, I guess, in trying to help students prepare for the real world of clinic, going from being resilient in an academic program to resilient and avoiding burnout in the clinic?
That's a great question. I mean, really, there are nuances to that question. I mean, I think a tangent, but what's related is this idea and this problem of mental health and graduate students and that overall process is certainly something that's been larger on my radar. The mental stress and challenges of students within our own clinic, I've seen it, as well as where my wife works at George Mason. And so it's a topic we've kind of come back to again this year. So it's interesting that for us, having the right clinical sites matter. At GW, where we had a standardized patient instruction approach, where we had actors come in, for us that was useful, because as opposed to working with the faculty member or working with a fellow student, working with those actors seemed to ramp up the expectations and bring out stress if there was stress to be had, to understand what that might be like, and to adapt to that stress so that the clinic is just a little easier than what it would be otherwise without having that experience. So I think small things like that matter. But a question that's difficult to answer, but something I'm definitely thinking about more, is how can we as faculty be more in tune to the mental health of our students and ways that we could be proactive to address it. I'm not sure if that's a matter of the student advisement and the advisee and student relationship being more keyed in it, or asking questions on a regular basis in an intentional way. That maybe that's a way forward. But I would agree with your premise. It's something we should both not only the clinical stress, but I think the academic stress. I want to ignore this part of the room.
Hi, Mike. Nice to meet you. I really appreciated that you saw some opportunities here in our program for orthopedic and geriatric residency programs. I was wondering, we've definitely done a lot of exploration into those arenas, and some of the barriers that we've encountered were really resources to support those programs. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the role of the PT program in supporting development of residency programs, both within and outside the institution.
Well, I think it's something that will become more popular and grow. I mean, I think that we're seeing that in the numbers. While it's not hugely popular, I think the trends are definitely upward. And it seems like, at least in my view, practice will move that way, even though we're charged to try to encourage and bring forth competent journalists in the profession. I think that especially practice will assert itself as medical practice becomes more complex. But when we talk about things like interprofessional education, which wasn't part of your question, but is related to this, and residencies, I'm very sensitive to increased faculty burden. Certainly during my time in Indianapolis, when they had the post-professional program, and it was a hybrid program, a big discussion was maintaining a legion of adjuncts and the management of that versus putting a burden on faculty to go in for the weekend and intensives that were needed to run their program. And that was a point of tension. So I think that if collectively the faculty thought that we didn't have enough faculty working hours to support those programs, then we should think twice about that. I don't think that adding those programs at the detriment of what you already do well would be worth what we would gain. So I think it's a thoughtful discussion, and it would be a matter of ushering those resources first before moving forward. I wouldn't move forward with that goal unless we thought that we had the resources to make it happen.
So I believe you addressed this question a little bit with regard to admissions, the comments that you had about kind of early admissions and things like that. I wonder, knowing the kind of priority of the APTA of increasing diversity in our profession, whether or not you've seen any strategies that have worked in terms of increasing racial and ethnic diversity within our profession.
Not many, but I have seen some. I mean, when I mentioned that early admissions process, part of what that process entails was identifying people who are already on your campus who might have an interest. And so I guess part of that is really fighting for the hearts and minds for people who are interested in movement sciences, but may not understand the opportunities that lie within physical therapy. So it's a two-part question in terms of what's your strategy on the campus, incoming freshmen, versus those job fairs and career fairs reaching beyond. I don't know much about the advertising strategy in terms of how you advertise nationally, so that might be another approach in terms of the HBCU system or other places where graduate students might find University of Colorado. And we want to think more broadly about what diversity means too. There's social economic diversity, and there's also thinking about the indigenous Indian population that we have here in the Four Corners region. And so there's a lot of ways to approach that I'll be open to talking to the faculty about.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I'm Jenny.
Hi, Jenny.
And I really appreciate you seem to be very much a collaborator in the many opportunities that you've encountered. And we're really trying to strengthen our relationships with our clinical partners. And I wonder if you could speak to what you see as sort of an ideal academic clinical partnership and how we might go about strengthening that.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? Like when you say partnership, so what type of partnership?
That's a great question. So I'm the director of clinical education. Okay. So really that's the context of how do we, and obviously we value our clinical partners very much and want to demonstrate that we value them, and also that it should be more collaboration versus them feeling that it's all give on their part and take on our part, but how do we collaborate and build an excellence in clinical education?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that. I think now remind me, in your program, do you offer kind of a workshop or any type of education for the clinical staff at the local hospitals? Do you tell them or give them any guidelines for how they should interact with students?
We do, and I think there's even with our local partners, even with our partners at UCH, I think time is trying to identify the best mechanism of how we can support them in their role as excellent clinicians and excellent teachers. We've tried different mechanisms, but like lunch and learns, and we provide the APTA CI credentialing courses. We do update courses, but still, I don't think it's one size fits all, and that's where we're trying to figure out maybe other ways to reach. We have quite a few rural partners and some out-of-state partners as well.
Sure. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of how it's definitely not a one size fits all. I mean, for rural partners, having ways to bring clinical continuing education to them is a useful strategy, one probably employ. We're talking a bit earlier about hybrid education and online education, and so I just wonder if we try to bring continuing education to those more distant facilities, if maybe the means or the mechanism could be through online CEUs for those places. One model we explored at some of the universities I've been a part of is that for those who are interested in their staff getting advanced credentialing or degrees, using the hybrid or online education to allow them to get post-professional degrees. And so part of that, I guess that tour, if you will, was finding out which centers would benefit from that, figuring out if that's something that they really wanted. And so for our major medical facilities, having post-professional education options, be it reduced tuition or access to it, was an advantage. Whereas, as you mentioned, for private practices, that was not so much of an inducement. So I think we do have to be creative there. I think particularly in this region, finding ways to reach out to the rural centers and the more distant facilities, that giving them the educational value perhaps that we can offer would be of value.
So I'm curious, as a manager, how would you manage competing needs for finite resources?
The competing needs for finding resources?
Finite. So when different people need and want different things, and you can't be all things to all people. So how have you managed that in a management role?
Well, I think in terms of the research role is talking to Jennifer and others and trying to figure out what the strengths are and focusing that. So anytime you look at that particular facet, you want to know what's the best way to build, to not to build for building's sake, but to find out how do you leverage the strengths. I mean, first and foremost, though, it's a DPT program, so the central focus is graduating those students. So there's always that sense of priority. I think the researchers know that. So certainly we'll be discussing it with staff to figure out where the priorities are. But when you think about the things that make a strong faculty or a strong program, it's not the U.S. News and Report rankings. It's really, what any student will want to look for: good student to faculty ratio, good facilities, talent and instructors, opportunities to go to sites that make sense, that go across the spectrum of acute care, the outpatient care. So I think that resources that will focus on that mission first will come first and foremost, and then leveraging and building our strengths, be it in research and other areas. Comments, concerns?
So you you piqued my interest regarding interprofessional education. I'm one of the people here who kind of pushes that from an educational perspective. So thoughts on, if you have experienced this within the education you've had, of how to do this, to really do authentic interprofessional education within the didactic curriculum. Have you had experience or have thoughts on how we can do this really well?
Well, some. I mean, for our VA program, it's actually funded through the Office of Academic Affairs, and its official title is actually the Interprofessional Rehabilitation Research Advanced Fellowship Program. And so that's part and parcel of it. So at the VA, we integrate that within our telehealth eval and assessment within PM&R. So that's one pathway forward. It's certainly not the only pathway forward. I've always wanted for our SPI exam at GW to integrate the nurses, the physician's assistant program, which is right adjacent to the PT program, and others in that environment. So I think that the SPI concept offers a good way forward that would minimize the faculty burden that sometimes comes up with interprofessional education. For me, one thing I see that's lacking or doesn't happen a lot is us linking with community colleges and other places that have the PTAs, for PTs to really find greater opportunities to work with PTAs and to understand what that professional relationship is. So certainly moving forward, that's something I would like to build on. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a standardized patient,
All right, I think we're about out of time, but thank you so much for your presentation.